Hello, Harriet from Millennium Library here with Derek Harnell, who is going to show you some beautiful perennial gardens that he has created over time. This will definitely give you some ideas on renovating, rejuvenating, refreshing, reinvigorating a perennial bed, which happens to be the title of this presentation. Derek is a master gardener, former garden blogger, and founder of the Winnipeg Bulb Project. And just to let you know, we have a number of gardening resources, as well as information for the beginner to the expert gardener. This includes print resources, as well as our RB Digital and Overdrive services for ebooks and e-audiobooks, and gardening e-magazines such as Backyard and Garden Design Ideas, ABC Organic Gardener Magazine, Gardener's World, Grow to Eat, and so many more. Browse and download ebooks and e-magazines using our Winnipeg Public Library card at winnipeg.ca/library. We also have a gardening info guide that contains links, book suggestions on growing food, harvesting, and harvesting challenges you might face, greening your space, or for the very beginner, information on expanding your skills, irrigation tips, and saving seeds. A variety of different types of information and resources. Click on info guides on our website to find this, as well as our other helpful guides.
Hi there, and thanks for joining tonight's review and session on renovating, rejuvenating, refreshing, reinvigorating a perennial bed. My name is Derek Yarnell, and I am a master gardener. I was the founder of the Winnipeg Bulb Project, which you can check out on Facebook if you are curious, and a garden blogger for a few years at a studentgardener.ca. Although I'm not actively blogging anymore, you can read more about some of the adventures in gardening that I've gotten into on the property we're going to be looking at tonight if you go to astudentgardener.ca. And with that, we'll jump right into our presentation. And what we'll be talking about tonight is really how do you bring some life if you want to change your garden bed. It's not refreshing your bed in terms of spring to-dos, a list of how to wake your garden up in the spring. It's really, if you want to bring some change to your perennial bed, what's a process to go about doing it. And so I will share with you the thinking that an approach that I take. So on the map here, we've got one of my beds and one of the maps that I put together. Certainly you do not need to go into that scale of detail on any of your garden beds. And here's an overview of the property itself. So that is my house and yard. And we're first going to look at what I call the moon garden, which is a garden with all white flowers. So if you are out there at night, that reflects back the moonlight and the flowers glow, which is a lovely experience. Then we're going to look at the Monet Garden, just a garden I have put together that has purple and blue and light colored hues, no bright brassy colors in the Monet Garden. And then we're going to look at the Sun Garden. Not a surprise there. That is the spot, my south-facing garden, where I can grow a different variety of plants. And then we're going to have a quick look at the backyard, where I do not have a fancy name for that garden yet. So if you have any ideas after the presentation, please feel free to get in touch with me. All right, WTF. It doesn't stand for what you probably think. It's a little acronym that hopefully will help everybody remember the approach that I'm going to take. And it stands tonight for watch, triage, and freshen, the three basic steps that we're going to see repeated as we look at refreshing each one of those different perennial beds. So watch means watch for one full season. And I understand that this is not easy to do. And if you are an eager gardener, you want to get in there and get your hands dirty and start making some change right away. If you've already lived in the property for many years and this is a bed that you're familiar with, that's great. You can fast forward right past that step because you already know what's working and what's not working. And by that, what we're talking about is the soil condition. We're talking about the amount of light and the amount of water. Those are, for me, the really three key pillars that I'm considering, although there's many other considerations that we'll touch on. Those are the things you really need to understand about your space to get the best out of your garden bed, and what watching it for a season or sometimes more can help you get a handle on. Next is the triage section. So when we're talking about triaging, it's what are you going to take from your existing perennial bed? What's in there that's working and what needs to go. So when we're talking about what's in the perennial bed, you can evaluate that by the structure of the plant, the shape, how large it is, how it defines borders, plant material, including the color of the blooms or the foliage, hardiness of the plant. Is it doing well? Does it struggle or need extra care? Is it healthy and robust, which gives you a clue about how it responds to the conditions, or is it sick and is likely to go, not anything you want to have to baby anymore? And are there pests involved that may make you want to include or exclude something that's currently in your bed? And then the final part of WTF for tonight is freshen, and then that's when you're actually really getting in there and doing the final stages to make things look their best. And again, you can be considering the structure, size, and location of the plants. And while we're on freshen, here's a couple of examples. When I moved in, the plant on the left, and sorry, moving in means 2012 to this property. And on the left, we have a beautiful Japanese lilac tree, which was an absolute mess of a shrub. You can see suckers galore. It hadn't been pruned in a donkey's age. And on the right-hand side, we see some Heliopolis plants, which are doing really well. So from a freshen perspective, that's observing what's working well in the space and deciding to divide and transplant and make more use out of that plant. And then freshen, of course, is also what are you going to bring in? Not just what are you going to leave, but you're probably going to have some space to bring in new plants, as all gardeners love to do. I would just make a note on this slide. You'll notice, if you can see closely, most of those plants are not native perennials. And since 2012, I have made a shift and encourage other people as well to seriously consider adding native perennials in your garden to make sure that we're creating enough habitat for the insects, caterpillars, etc., that are so important in our food web. A little tip in terms of freshening that everyone has the ability to do is grouping. And it's important in lots of aesthetic pursuits, including gardening, but that's just putting a lot of similar things together in one place to increase the impact that they're having. And in this slide, under a spruce tree, there's two different colored circles. The red circle is where, when I found a succulent growing in my yard, instead of having 50 of them spread out everywhere, I put them together under this spruce so they could have a bigger impact together. In the orange circles are some other succulents. I thought, hey, if one succulent is working, I'm going to introduce some other ones for a variety. And that photo was taken in 2014. The next slide is 2015. And you can see that the only succulent remaining in there is the one that I was finding in my yard already and grouping together. And by 2016, it had grown into this lovely mat where the arrows are pointing, a thick green lush mat with absolutely none of the succulents I had introduced remaining, completely made up of succulents that I was finding around my yard. So another shout out to the power of native perennials here, but really to that power of grouping, a simple technique that makes sure that your flowers garner the attention that they want. Unless it's a very unique plant that you want to highlight, grouping them together certainly helps them stand out more. So on to the moon garden in the front of the house, and it's a bit south facing, although we'll see what that means in terms of sunlight for this garden. So this is what it looked like in 2012. And in the watch stage, I found, although it's not a gorgeous shot of a garden here, it's really important the way the sunlight is cutting across the garden, because that's, for me, the biggest learning out of watching it for a while, was the bed runs east to west, and the first 2 feet of the garden bed from front to back get a lot more sun, and then there is a pretty defined line, so the back half of the garden doesn't get nearly as much sun. And that completely influences the kinds of plants that are going to have success in the front of the garden versus the back of the garden. And if I hadn't taken the time in the first year to watch it and put in some annuals rather than investing in perennials, I wouldn't have guessed that the sunlight was going to fall in this way, and probably would have had to replant a whole lot of things, because it was quite dramatic to have this line, this very distinct line delineating the sun or not. And in the triage kind of aspect, I'm looking at the structure, I'm looking at the plant material and the color of the plants and the other things that we discussed. And we can see here some examples. So when I was looking at the structure of this garden, you may see certain things yourselves, but what I saw was these cedars, which to me looked a little awkward. I assume they were designed to create some sense of border or height, but for me, they blocked a beautiful view. My neighbor's yard is part of my view, and I didn't want those cedars blocking it and not really being too healthy or robust in any case. They were fine, but not great. The little red circle in the back there is an empty space, an empty garden bed in my neighbor's yard. But again, if I can see it, I consider it mine. And I found that generally, if you're polite and you ask your neighbors, they tend to agree to you gardening in their space if you provide the labor and the plants. So that's what I do. And in the next slide, we'll see also at the base of their large elm trees, there was another border, but no small plants in there. So I see opportunity from a structure perspective in there. When it comes to the plant material, there's not a lot going on in this garden bed in 2012. What's encircled down at the bottom there is a very dry daylily. And other than that, pretty much everything in this garden bed was the dreaded creeping bellflower, a horrible, horrible invasive plant with small purple flowers that was brought over as an ornamental because it's pretty, but absolutely takes over and doesn't leave any room for native perennials and all the ecological benefit that they bring. So this was then 2016. So 4 years later, we got it looking like this. You can see in the back, there are now daylilies in what was that empty garden bed in the neighbor's property, and there are now lily of the valley planted around the base of those other trees. So filling in those empty spots from a structural perspective. 2017 now on the right, and it's looking pretty good. However, when we look at 2017 in close view, now on the left-hand side, what's in that red circle is the dreaded creeping bellflower. It's still there. So when we talked about understanding what you want to keep and what you want to get rid of, sometimes getting rid of isn't just a choice that you're tired of a plant or it's not working in those conditions, but it can also be about weeds. And in this case, a very pervasive one that I still have in that garden bed today and may have in that garden bed forever. It's just a question of keeping it at bay. Here's another part further down of the moon garden, and this is what it looked like in 2012. It's August, it's a little dry, but from a structure perspective, we've got those cedars again, right? From a plant material perspective, we have a gorgeous peony right up in the front there. There it is, and it's big and healthy and robust, which is important to observe. And then from a freshen perspective, we've got some evidence that there hasn't been any pruning happening in terms of care in this garden space, and there's some dead branches and some branches that are casting too much shade more than they need to, blocking the view. And so when we go from 2012 to 2013, it's a pretty dramatic difference just with implementing some of those basic techniques that we talked about. So the dead branches are gone, the hanging down branches that are providing too much shade and blocking the view have been pruned back. From a freshen perspective, some annuals on the right-hand side were added there for some temporary color while I figured out what perennials would really work best in the environment. And that peony is highlighted and given more space and more prominence than it was in the last version in 2012. And then here's just a view of that bench, because when we were talking about watching your garden to understand there was critters, right? Are there pests or critters? And as much as I love the deer and absolutely love having them in my neighborhood, I know many people feel they're pests because they eat a lot of your garden, and they certainly affect what you can plant and not plant with the expectation of whether it will get eaten. I'm happy to cohabitate with the deer, but certainly understanding the critters that visit your garden is an important part of what you can learn in that watch phase. So we see here in 2016, Circled in red is that peony that was here before I got here and doing so well. And I took my cue from that. And I know that the peony is doing well in this environment. So what you see now in that red box with dotted lines is a whole whack of peony. I've gone out at that stage and added more of what was already working. And it's a surefire way generally, or your chances are pretty good. If one of these plants is doing well, you can probably add more into the same environment and see them do equally well. So that was a successful refresh of one perennial bed. To recap from watching, I learned about where the sun was landing. From triaging, we got rid of those cedars, which made a big difference right away in terms of opening up the space to the rest of the street, that view. And freshening, we did some pruning and added some temporary plants while we thought about longer term decision making in terms of plant material. And then we will now look at the Monet Garden, which is right in front of the living room windows between the sidewalk and the house. So very prominent as you're moving into the home. And one of the first things and fun things to highlight is my secret slice of sunlight. And I call it my secret slice because it was secret from me for 3 years. So as much as I talked about watching your garden for 1 year to learn about it, sometimes it takes longer. I had in this instance some globe thistle or echinops and a variety of iris that were doing really well in what otherwise is a fairly shady garden. And I was curious as to what was going on. And honestly, it was 3 years before I realized, and we can see in the next slide, that as the sun crossed the sky, there was a period in the morning where the sun cut right between the neighboring house and the trees, and there's this slice of sunlight where there was a few hours of extra sunlight cutting through a garden that runs north-south. And it's so there's about 5 feet of it from side to side, a very small patch in that garden bed that had a very different circumstance. And I was able to grow totally different kinds of plants because they got more sun just in that one part of the garden. And while watching for 1 year didn't help me figure out what was going on. It just, gardening is a game that requires patience, and the learnings can take some time. So in our triage step, we're looking at the structure here, and you can see that the original garden beds have some lovely curve and a little bit of lawn left out in the front. Curves are always great in a garden, and so I took my cue from that, and this is now 2016, 4 years later, and you can see I've highlighted with red there that I kept that original shape of where the lawn was that has now been turned into garden, and highlighted it with a tall border in the back to really accent that curve. I mean, nobody but me necessarily knows that it reflects the original state of the yard, but there was something probably more emotional to me about honoring the original garden bed in this way from a structure perspective. Also from the triage, we're looking at the plant material. So we can see there's some really big shrubs here that have completely grown in front of the windows, which can often happen when people plant things near windows that seem small at the time they're planted, but eventually grow much larger. And we look at the plant material, we see some Lamium, which is a low-growing ground cover on the left-hand side, and we see some giant hybrid lilies that I had never seen before and found quite spectacular. So I was very intrigued by them. So that's the 2012 view. Now in 2016, wow, what a difference. This Lamium, so this is a ground cover now on the right-hand side and extending all along the side of the sidewalk. That is literally the same plant material. I didn't buy any. That is the same plant material that we saw in 2012, those small patches. But I moved it over here and gave it better conditions. It had better sun and better water here and really took off, and is a great ground cover for me in this case to replace that grass, and a very dramatic difference. You can also see from this photo taken in 2014 how I added more of the giant lilies. Again, I thought they're working here and I love them, so let's put in some more. Those ones are a little smaller because they take a few years to get to their true height, but it was, again, learning from what was working and trying to understand why it was working and what you can do. The other difference that's quite obvious is the big bush, this what is actually a Korean lilac, is no longer covering the window. It's been dramatically pruned, and pruned in a way that I love pruning to begin with, but it's a fun kind of pruning where I uplimbed it dramatically. So there's no foliage, up to about 6 feet, and then it bursts from the top. And part of the benefit of what happens when doing that is there's much less greenery for the tree to support, but it's still got all the amazing roots and activity happening below ground, and it just burst into bloom in a way that it had not and was not when it was a big messy shrub. So pruning and freshening really had an impact with this one, and the Korean lilac smells absolutely intoxicating near the front door, and it's just been in bloom this past week and it's been heavenly. We can see there was another shrub in the back. I put an X through, just wanted to point that out because we're going to come back to it in a few minutes. So that was a successful refresh. Watching, I found the secret sunlight. For triage, looking at the environment, it was that Lamium really rescued me and came in and did a wonderful job of being a ground cover. And then freshen, boy, that pruning really freshened. That is the same plant, you practically wouldn't know it. However, as much as that was a successful refresh, in October of 2014, we had some basin flooding, and this is the garden in 2014. As much as I had just finished refreshing it, sometimes these things happen. So we have a second refresh of the same space. And what I did, I left the lilies, but in that time, I had realized that it was a shadier garden than I had thought. So what I've done is put in an understory of ostrich ferns, a gorgeous native plant with fantastic structure. And you can also see here some forget-me-nots to just add some color as the ferns are growing up. So the lilies stayed because I'd already put them there, but the other plants weren't getting enough light. I moved them out and added this understory of ostrich ferns in, and that garden is now, to this day, still remains ostrich ferns and lilies that can grow up taller than them. The sun garden is the next garden we're going to WTF together. And this is what it looked like in 2012. We're just going to look at this bed. You'll see in slides, there's some other activity happening because I also put a new garden bed in this space. But when we're talking about refreshing the existing bed, we're going to focus on that space right in front of the big bay window off the living room. So when I watched it, I saw these very bright pink colors, not my favorite color for plants in the garden. And I have removed all of those plants. We're going to see that there was daylily in there, and in the sunny garden, this is the sun garden after all, is much too dry, and they look horrible by the end of the summer. That's from August, and all the daylily are dead and dried up. They should really be in a shadier spot. And also watching, I thought, well, what the heck is this beautiful round plant? It's a hardy geranium. I'd never seen one like that before. And the part circled in red, well, that's a little bit of that succulent that I mentioned when we were talking about grouping. So a small little piece of it there, I picked it up and I planted it into the bigger group, and it eventually turned into this gorgeous carpet that really served its purpose to keep other weeds down and add some lovely color to the garden. So in terms of structure, the one thing that jumps about structure in this garden is that big shrub that's completely blocking the view out to the street from the big bay window. And the bay window is a feature of the home and lets light in and gives you a great view. So this plant is in conflict with the design of the window, and we'll see what happens to it in a moment. Also, in terms of triaging what's going to stay and what's going to go, in this case, it extended beyond plant material to the compost. I understand that this meant it was close to the kitchen door, but I didn't want it in my garden. So now we have the compost gone, a cherry tree going to be planted there, and the garden extended to incorporate the space that the compost had been. So that's all in terms of the structure. So you can modify, even in refreshing your perennial bed. If you do too much work, then it's a new bed. But in this case, I would consider extending or changing the shape of the bed itself to be part of observing the structure and refreshing that bed. And then from a plant material perspective, I've labeled the things, but there's a variety of things in there: Heliopsis, phlox, blackcurrant, geranium, dianthus, peony, iris, lily of the valley, a whole bunch of things, even though it looked like a very unkempt and hadn't really been tended in a number of years. And of course, back to this hardy geranium for a second, because it reinforces, once again, understanding what's working in your garden through observation and doubling down on it. So what I've done here we're seeing the new garden bed in place. But what it is, and I'll highlight it a little bit here with the red line, is I used hardy geraniums. I bought a whole bunch of hardy geraniums and used them as the border plant all the way around this new garden bed. And that was based on watching what was in my existing perennial bed, seeing that the hardy geranium was gorgeous and lush and doing really well, and saying to myself, hey, if that hardy geranium is working well, I'm going to use it in this other garden bed. So we've strayed slightly from refreshing the bed we were focused on, but I did want to reinforce this idea of how powerful observation can be when you are seeing what's working in your bed, knowing that the conditions, the soil conditions, the water conditions, the nutrients, whatever's happening in that space is working for that plant. And it had fantastic results. On this slide, this is where I'm calling out that that giant shrub is gone. And so I don't take removing a big shrub lightly. I like to have as much green space, but it's conflict with the design of the home and blocking the view of that window just wasn't sitting right with me, and I'm very pleased to have had it removed from a structure perspective. Again, so that's what it looked like in 2012. And 1 year after move-in in 2013, it looked like that. So still far from what it looked like in 2016. What we do have across the back here is a row of Heliopsis. So the Heliopsis is this native perennial, about 3 feet tall, with the yellow flowers, self-seeds a lot, easy to grow. I've had great success with it. And I used it as a border. So once again, taking a cue from my environment. It was a healthy, robust plant there. I divided it and used it throughout the yard. Then for color, I added some contrasting liatris, and there was already purple clematis there. And by 2014, we already had what I would consider a successful refresh. So in the watching section, I realized that it got more sun than I'd realized, and was good for some of the plants, like the lily of the valley. The triaging and what am I keeping, that healthy Heliopsis really sent me some signals that it was happy there, and I doubled down on it. And from a freshen perspective, yeah, it was using that Heliopsis to really define the border. However, we know what happened in 2014, don't we? The basement flood. So this was the garden in the fall of 2014, all dug up and moved around the side of the house for a couple of weeks. And then when I put it back in, of course, I had some decisions to make. Do I put every plant where it came from? Of course not. It's an opportunity to rethink and do something different. So I tried an unsuccessful refresh. I was interested and remain interested in prairie-like settings, incorporating grasses into your garden. Rather than using clumping grasses, I used grass seed and got really a mess of grass. My husband brought some gladiola bulbs, which are the red flowers, and I added back in the liatris. And you can see in the next slide that there wasn't too much color in the summer in July, and it was really looking pretty bedraggled by this time September rolled around. So I wasn't happy with that attempt at a refresh, which I think it's important as gardeners to share our failures as much as our successes, because that's so often how we learn, by trial and error. So this whole garden bed went through one season of trial and error. And then in 2016, I reverted back to a Heliopsis, again, without having to purchase a single Heliopsis plant, just by dividing the other plants on my property. And some plants are easier to divide than others. Heliopsis does very well. I was able to refill that bed with a lot of color, Heliopsis, and of course the liatris are still there. For 2020, as of today, I took out about half of the yellow Heliopsis this year and added in some asters in an attempt to tone down the brassy, bright yellow colors and bump up the amount of purples. I think if I get to a mix of about 20 or 30% yellows, and the rest purple. That's my goal. And just to point out that the refresh continues, and for so many gardeners like myself is really a continuous process. And now we will have a look at our final garden, the backyard. And what did it look like in 2012? Well, that's what it looked like. What do we have here? We have, from a structure perspective, an absolutely unique window in a wall with some wrought iron. It is a round window with some wrought iron going through there, but you can't really see it too much. And from a plant material perspective, we really just have some daylilies, or at least that's all I could see in 2012. So the following year, we have pruned back a lot of what were grapevines, because I wanted to see that stucco wall. I thought it was quite interesting, not just the window itself, but the structure of the wall as well. And the red circle now, from a plant material perspective, shows that once I got rid of the weeds and some other material in there, it revealed that there was a whole bunch of lilies growing in there. So this is a good reminder of the importance of watching, because in 2012, I couldn't even tell that there were lilies in there at all. It looked just like daylilies and weeds. These had probably died back, or as it turns out, been eaten by the lily beetle, which is why they may not have been visible in the prior fall. From a freshen perspective, what did I do? Well, daylilies and other lilies can benefit from being divided, and these had not been divided in ages. So I dug them up, I divided them and replanted them. And what did that look like? So instead of having this wall covered in grapevines with some stuff unidentified at the bottom, we now have a completely different looking walls, a window you can see through, and lilies planted throughout. They're a little bit draggled in this photo because it's just after transplant, but you can see in the next slide, even by August the following year, they were looking healthier and blooming, and that's how that garden looked at that time. So I considered that a successful refresh. From watching, there wasn't too much that I learned over time, other, of course, than the lilies, which had been hiding. From a triaging perspective, what do we want to keep? It was important to me to unhide the structure. And from a freshen perspective, it was taking advantage of that existing plant material, dividing it, and the plants responded so well. From a freshening perspective, that idea of freshening, many plants really respond well to a division. They appreciate being given the opportunity to grow more. I will just point out that because of the lily beetle, all those lilies were pulled out and removed from my garden, which is drastic and not necessarily required. But just to point out that a new refresh was kicked off in 2015. And here you can see quite a bit of Jacob's ladder, which happens to be in front of that window, and some clematis now growing up and through that window, which is really beautiful. But again, just to point out this process of what we're talking about, rejuvenating a perennial bed, you can think of it as a one-time exercise, or you can think of it as a constant approach. And whichever way that you think of rejuvenating and refreshing your perennial bed, our WTF format of watching to understand your garden, triaging to evaluate what you want to keep and what you might want to have taken out, and freshening from pruning to adding new plants is a great way to think of refreshing your perennial bed. So thank you for your time tonight and accompanying me on this tour down memory lane of my property. And I would just add, again, please consider native plants when you're looking to refresh your garden. It can have a huge impact on our environment. And again, if you wanted to see any more, I was actively blogging at the time. I was working on a lot of these gardens, and there's lots of stories that cover it more in depth on my website blog, which is still up. So thank you again, and Harriet, back to you.
Thank you to Derek, and thank you for watching. Amazing to see how Derek has put together his perennial beds. Very, very inspiring. But the main message he is sending to us all is to not be afraid to try something new. So we have lots of information on growing perennials at Winnipeg Public Library, both online and in print. Some of our titles include Best Perennials for Sun and Shade, Easy Plants for More Beautiful Gardens, as well as the Perennial Matchmaker, create amazing combinations with your favorite perennials. So check out our catalog. And please follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.